This is Berkeley Talks, a UC Berkeley news podcast from the Office of Communications and Public Affairs that features lectures and conversations at Berkeley. You can follow Berkeley Talks wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on YouTube at Berkeley News. New episodes come out every other Friday. You can find all of our podcast episodes with transcripts and photos on UC Berkeley News at news.berkeley.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the Townsend Center. We're really pleased to host Hannah Zeavin today. Hannah is the professor of the History of Science and New Media in the Department of History and the Berkeley Center for New Media. She's also the founding editor of the journal Parapraxis, associate editor for Psychoanalysis and History, and editorial associate for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. I was so impressed by all that editorial work. I'm only able to deal with one journal right now. She's here to discuss the her recent publication, Mother Media, Hot and Cool Parenting in the 20th Century. Hannah is joined by Ramsey McGlaser, who's a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature. I wanted to mention a few events that are happening in our Art of Writing program over the course of the next week. Tomorrow, October 16th, we're hosting the Russian writer Viktor Arefiev, who will deliver a talk, The New Barbarism, Putin, Trump, and a Lost World. And that event will take place in this room at 5 o'clock. And then next Monday, October 20th, the television writer Sanjay Shah, who's a Berkeley grad, graduated in 1999, Sanjay will discuss writing for the entertainment industry, from breaking into the industry to running a writer's room. And this conversation is intended for students who are interested in working in Hollywood. So I ask that you please spread the word amongst your undergraduates. So Hannah and Ramsey, we're very excited for your conversation. So you take the mic.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really and truly a pleasure and privilege to be in conversation with you, Hannah, my colleague, friend, and role model. So here to share the good news about the book Mother Media, but I also thought I'd be remiss not to plug Hannah's first book called The Distance Cure, which is really amazing. So if you haven't already had the experience of reading The Distance Cure, run, don't walk to buy it. I wondered if we could get started by just talking about how writing that first book prepared you to write the second. Whether you see Mother Media as a sequel to The Distance Cure, or you understand that relationship between the two books in some other way.
Thank you, Ramsey and Stephen and Michaela and everyone at Townsend Center. And really, it is mutual, and that's so nice of you. Sure. I mean, the Distance Cure has a kind of normal story, which is that it was my dissertation book. And when you're a graduate student and preparing to go in the job market, right, they ask you to furnish a kind of a proverbial second project that may or may not be real. But a long time ago, there was a project called Mother's Little Helpers, Technology in the American Family. And the book project then, in many ways, does not resemble this book, though it has all the same kind of keywords, and the Library of Congress would probably categorize the book that never got made and this book the same way. It was a kind of meant to be a sequel, which is that The Distance Cure, which is a history of teletherapy, ends with this coda that I was asked to write because the book starts in 1890 and went through the kind of 80s, except we had found ourselves in the year 2020. And so suddenly teletherapy went from this word that no one could pronounce. Literally everyone would say, Hannah, you're the author of The Distance Cure, a history of telepathy, which I also am, because that is actually a big part of the book. So it was accurate to really knowing what teletherapy was, because folks were doing it in their car outside their home to hide from their child and or whatever. And that book ends by really trying to think with Fanon and Melanie Klein about why people experience not perfect mediated encounters with the analyst differently. So if you can take yourself back to that traumatic time, it doesn't have to be your analyst, but when the Zoom call would glitch or the call would drop, And we have this kind of AT&T, I believe it's, or maybe it's Verizon, has an entire play with this in a commercial. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? And all of those interactions were coming up for folks at the very sort of beginning of the pandemic. And I was interviewing them about their experience in teletherapy. See, I almost just did it myself. It's totally an honest parapraxis, if you will. So the point there was that Melanie Klein wanted to think about how the external world and the internal world rhyme. People make it out that Melanie Klein is a sort of like less political psychoanalyst. And I actually think this is a great political thing she takes on. And so I was thinking about the media outside, the literal Zoom call, and the medium inside, the kinds of ways that different people can negotiate being dropped, a really loud psychoanalytic formulation for someone like Winnicott, on the phone. And alongside Fanon, who shows us that actually a perfect medium that's all signal and no noise, A, doesn't exist, and B, may not be the medium you want. And so I was playing with these two things, the medium inside, and I was like, right, where would a medium inside come from but the mother? The mother, the first experience, like kind of the mother in big scare quotes, but as that loved object. And so that was the start of this book. This book has very little to say about the question that convened it, which is because I learned from experience. The book instead does something totally else and wants to take the observation that media have been called in all the time for child rearing. The US culture has a very intense feeling about that. That feeling, of course, might be related to the mother. And the book wants to make the argument that it's not maybe, it's totally. That media and mother are confused aspects of daily life in this nation.
So you've begun to anticipate my next question, which was just going to invite you to lay out the argument in broad strokes of mother media. Maybe a place to start might be with just a quick definition of each of the following: mother as medium, and then media as mother.
I'm like, it's my dissertation defense. Except we don't do that here at Berkeley. Yeah, sure. I would love to. So like, if I abandon the idea, not totally, I mean, it's there, but that I wanted to figure out these early mediatic environments for children and how they got recalled later, something did really sort of stick with me, which is that, and maybe it's because I'm on the plane a lot, but this kind of moment where a mother or a parent hands their child an iPad to keep the child quiet because we live in a society hostile to children and their noise. And people turn around to judge that parent. And it's a micro gesture. It's very quick. But I was really interested in how that came to be as a kind of social conceit, alongside the fact that like the last standing public health recommendation in this nation is not to give a child a screen until they're 2 years of age, because everything else has been gutted by this point. But those were the sort of two things. And I think that I wanted to basically answer how that came to be by looking at two archives that are also often basically held apart totally. One is my home sort of literature of psychologists, psychiatrists, pediatricians, who are trying to think about very newly after 1938, let's say, what a mother is and how she should be to produce the best kind of child you can produce. And media technologists, researchers, eventually theorists, media gurus, people involved with Sesame Street, say, and how they were thinking about media coming in to the home and doing the proxy labor for mothering. And not just with screen media, which I think is the most overt example, but in fact with the baby monitor starting in the 1930s and so on. So to define, which was the question.
The invitation.
The invitation, the offering.
The offering.
So mother as medium is what I sort of do to bring together all of the different terms from all of those people, pediatricians, psychologists, psychoanalysts, many of whom like totally disagree with each other about literally everything and would have liked to get into like fights on alleyways, except for the idea that the mother should be the total conveyance of care. And this is represented as universal, immutable, ahistorical on purpose, even though it's registering actually a whole host of changes in terms of labor, gender, race, and class in the United States, but becomes immutable in 1938. So the behaviorists are like, mother, input for good baby output. Psychoanalysts are doing something totally otherwise, but they all agree. And media researchers reverse that footing, that instead of thinking of the maternal matrix, say, which is a synonym for media, they want to think about how media can convene a kind of maternal environment for the child. Do, again, that work of standing in, especially as labor, again, changes. And so, in fact, the media researchers know they're registering a huge techno-sociological shift, political shift. The psychoanalysts, unfortunately, I have to say, do not. And it's that interaction that the book studies between mother as medium and media as mother.
That's really interesting what you just said about the convergence, like simultaneous divergence and convergence of the behaviorists and the psychoanalysts. Would you want to say more about that? Like, how does that work? How come they end up figuring the mother in similar?
Sure. I mean, so like the other sort of major backbone of the book, never can go away, is history of the family. But in 1920, as an example, the kind of major child rearing manual is by John Watson, behavioralist, who argues that you should not kiss your child ever because you will spoil that child. Oh, and definitely all children should have their own bedroom in a crib, because that is how they will become an independent, good, strong American, right? Now we can play it for laughs, but like then, but that the mother, not the nanny, not the grandparents, not the father, there are like no present fathers. Father is a huge absence that I try and deal with by naming it as such and a few other things, but the mother should be that conveyance. And from the 20s and 30s all the way until 45, when Dr. Spock, who, you know, is the now still kind of best-selling, undergirds so much of parenting literature guy, makes a quote-unquote revolution in parenting literature, that's the thing. And across the entire period, we go from Freud, who had actually not cared so much about the mother, very little. It's very overblown by the New Yorker cartoon that says, the analyst says that they're always asking us, tell me about your mother. For Freud, like, not really. It was like, tell me about other stuff and dad. And dreams and masturbation and all this other stuff. But a whole new generation, a second generation of psychoanalysts really did become obsessed with the mother. And again, they also hate each other and don't agree with each other about anything. And they include Anna Freud and Melanie Klein, and also names less known, probably to this audience, but who are all really thinking about the maternal, so much so that they get called the maternalists. Ferenczi is part of that. It's kind of 1.5 generation. And so even though they totally disagree, they really begin to think that the infant's either mental picture or their input-output structures will rely exclusively on one person. And so all of Freud's interest in the nanny and the governess disappears. All of the interest in kind of cross-class interactions disappears. All of that really becomes narrowed down to, there is a dyad, it is a mother-baby, and to quote Winnicott, there is no such thing as a mother-baby. There's just one unit, right? There's not any separation. You can't have them apart. And it shows up everywhere.
So your book's subtitle is Hot and Cool Parenting in the 20th Century. I wanted to invite you to just say more about hot and cool parenting. Who were hot mothers and who are cool mothers, by which you don't mean, right, it's period specific. You don't mean the cool mom, right, who wants to be friends with her child's adolescent friends, right? You mean something else. Could you just share with us that history?
I did this to myself. But we can also blame Marshall McLuhan. But it is operant, right? In fact, the hot mother is also a sexual and over-sexualized mother. The cold mother is actually a frigid mother. No, it's not really the mom. I always think of, what is the movie? Mean Girls, the mom who really, 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 really wants to be in. When we think of that kind of mother. All of these resonances are actually really important. It comes from, there is a pair of chapters at the middle of the book that I think are the center of the book. This comes from the third chapter, which is called Hot and Cool Mothers, which wants to understand two things. One, from the 40s to the 60s, psychology writ large, so psychiatry especially, was attempting to do something that is really important in the 20th century, which is to separate out autism from schizophrenia, which were originally the same diagnosis. Autism was a diagnosis that presented early. A synonym would be early onset schizophrenia, and schizophrenia late. At the beginning of the 20th century in the US, schizophrenia was understood to mostly affect white women, upper class women. I'm going to just keep with the like pop references, like in the not universally loved, but often enjoyed TV show Dickinson, of Emily Dickinson's life, where it's reimagined. Her mother goes to the asylum because she hates the idea of having to take care of her husband one more second, right? And so there's a kind of madness of the upper class, of the white woman who is like just done with patriarchy. That is a kind of representation of the early 20th century schizophrenic patient. And it would come on in childhood. These are these same idea. And starting in the 30s and 40s, this guy, Leo Kanner, who really sort of helps to invent the new discipline of child psychiatry, is working at Johns Hopkins. He's obsessed with historical dental records and syphilis. Is like, oh, actually what I'm going to do is invent and sort of separate out this brand new diagnosis. As these things go, it gets called Kanner syndrome. We know it today as autism. And he begins to understand that every single person he's seeing in his clinic is the child of a college-educated mother. And the father is almost always one of his colleagues. So lots of children of psychiatrists. They're in Baltimore. The fact of Baltimore doesn't register at all, right? Every single one of the patients is a Hopkins person, an i.e. white upper class, Jules Gill Peterson, where it's a really important history that looks at this clinic across the street. These are the trans children who are being brought there, there's a kind of very similar story. And all of a sudden, he's like, good, we've got it. Autistic children are as if in an icebox that never defrosts. And he starts thinking of the mother as being, again, the medium of care, and thus the entire reason, along with something called genetics, i.e. the mother has passed on both her innate qualities. And it's a kind of like begetting like. That's the cold mother. The second part is the hot mother. And Kanner, too, is responsible for thinking of an opposite kind of mother that's going to go on to produce a kind of schizophrenic child. And that mother is the smother mother in its earliest incarnation, but goes on over the cross of the 20th century to be attached not to whiteness, not to frigidity, not to coldness, but to blackness, right? And so we see the way that this over and over again gets accumulated until we get to the Monahan report. And so suddenly there are kind of two mother types. They are hyper-racialized, they're classed, to the point where, one of the people I write about in my book, Dorothy Groomer, is going to try and get a diagnosis as a Black woman in Kanner's student's clinic for her autistic son. And they say to her, it's impossible. He could not be autistic. And the reason is because that icebox baby transforms to the refrigerator mother, which we probably know as a sort of signifier that still circulates in the US. And refrigerator mothers are all white, a priori. It becomes part of the diagnosis. So then we have what's called in my field diagnostic apartheid. Autism becomes completely white. And as Jonathan Metzl has shown in his really landmark book, The Protest Psychosis, schizophrenia becomes attached politically to Blackness. And this kind of separation is complete first on the grounds of mothers. And so I look at that, but I'm also looking at why refrigerator, why temperature. And so, yes, we have answers about like the Cold War and all of these metaphorics being so intense at that moment, but also registering the shifts in how people were living. And the change between literally the icebox and the refrigerator is indexed here, and it's indexed in the home. And so I can say much more about that, but that's one of these places. And over and against that, that group of people is all borrowing language from, and vice versa, Marshall McLuhan, who's also at the very same time trying to separate out cultures and media objects and everything between this hot and cold binary that maps directly. And by 62, McLuhan's a household name, things have changed, right? But at the same time, Kanner is also, and they're often being cited alongside each other. And so that chapter tries to tell that story.
So at the end of that chapter, you refer to this complex of theories as a punitive media theory of parenting. Amazing phrase, or punitive media theory of parenting. And then in chapter 4, which is really incredible, really highly recommend to everyone here, you move from this punitive media theory of parenting into the punitive space of the US prison system. And I'm just going to quote, I'm a literary critic, so I'm going to take the liberty of quoting you for a second, where you say what you do in that chapter is to show how the following is borne out, right? That mother might not be the right medium of care became a question raised in the mind sciences and then answered in the carceral system. So I'll read that one more time. That mother might not be the right medium of care became a question raised in the mind sciences and then answered in the carceral system. Could you walk us through as much of that chapter as you'd like to?
Sure. It's again, like in the preceding chapter where it's telling like 3 stories at once. So the first story is, and this is like a weird thing about the book. So many of the actors on the psych side of things are Viennese emigres, just not anywhere in Austria. I mean, they're Viennese emigres. They were all working with Freud or adjacent to him. So Renee Spitz, who I think is lesser known, but was absolutely part of the second generation of psychoanalysts in Vienna, has to emigrate, as they all -1 do in the 30s, and first goes to Paris and then to New York City, where also a lot of this book takes place. And Spitz, and this is the answer to why the 30s, why does this change happen in the 30s? Spitz is able to work for the first time with all of these children who've been separated from their mothers, as has Anna Freud is doing in London, because you can't, although it has happened, of course, like you can't in the 20th century exactly on purpose separate children from their mothers for psychiatric research. You have to find the condition where that is already happening. The orphanage is one, the bomb shelter is another, the US prison is another site where these family separations are happening all the time. And that is a kind of subtending, very uncomfortable part of the book, is that, right, all these different kinds and qualities of family separation are running through it because they can be used over and against control homes, which are always middle-class white families, to say this is where the pathology is. And so Spitz is doing this work that's emphatically on the side of mothers. He's like, children should be with their mothers. And so if the punitive idea from chapter 3 is that every one of these mothers, whether you're a hot mother, you're a cool mother, you're a terrible mother, and you've created mass pathology, not just in your individual child, but literally en masse, Spitz is like, children need to be with their mothers all the time. And so he's working in the orphanage on reunification. He's working in the US prison on unification with mothers and children, at the same time as he's advancing his theories about why mothers must be the medium of care for their kids. And at the same time, all of that research is happening. By the way, that research is still ongoing in this prison. There's all of these different attempts to re-evince forms of family separation through the carceral. So it became a question for me, like, it seemed like sometimes historians are like, I just got to figure it out. Which prison Spitz was working in, because it's never been described in the literature. The experiment is famous in the history of psychiatry, but where? No. And it turns out it was easy in a way to figure out because there's only one prison where mothers and babies were allowed to be together in the United States in the 1940s. And it was called Westfield State Farm. It's now known as Bedford Hills Prison in upstate New York. It's now most famous for 2 reasons. One is, like San Quentin here, it's a go-home prison. That's what that kind of term of art is. So there's a lot of programming. So like at San Quentin for 20 plus years, there's been this work done by many people at this university, and not only so it is too at Bedford Hills, which is a women's prison, but also because for 100 years, they've had this mother-infant prison program that has also funded all this psych research. And some of the earliest drug research is happening on these mothers and on and on. So they're just this captive population who are constantly being turned into actuarial data. So that's one of the stories that the book tries to tell. And the other is how then that research that insists that children need the same adult to care for them, their mother, over and over again, gets flexibly turned back on that same population. And so it tries to tell the story of how attachment research in the US prison both is responsible or is used, is mobilized, bless you, to create many, many more mother-infant prison programs, which it did do, but also how that same research is used to further family separation in the United States, especially as it's met the digital. So I can say much more about the current contemporary political stakes of that, but looking at how Spitz is, again, profoundly, emphatically pro-maternal, research has also been used against the very same women he sought to reunite with children over the course of another 80 years. And I think that's what I mean by that and that chapter.
When the chapter begins, you're describing these algorithmic sentencing systems that are truly dystopian in Wisconsin. Yeah. Would you want to return to that moment?
Recently there's been, maybe it was 7 months ago or something, but time is so weird now. There was a lot of attention in the popular press to this runoff in Wisconsin around a judicial seat. And people are like, why Wisconsin? Why is it getting so much attention? Yes, Elon Musk was involved, but it's because Wisconsin, on the question of sentencing via algorithms and a few other things, is basically the highest court in the United States, because the Supreme Court has refused to hear those cases. And they have gone through appeal at the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. So it becomes a strange court to watch politically, not just because there are people living in Wisconsin and they are our comrades known and unknown to us, but because actually it's law of the land. Okay, so Wisconsin heard a case 5 years ago that was about the question of predictive sentencing and, in turn, making a new amendment to a law that said that if a mother or a father were to be separated from their child for more than 6 months, and we could predict it would happen again, they would lose their custody rights forever. And it passed. And it passed while I was working on the Spitz. And that's how it became the beginning. Because when you look through the kinds of testimony, et cetera, they're mobilizing attachment research to say that children need stable figures of attachment. If there's any idea that this person would not be stable at the same time as the government and the system has ensured that this will happen, right, via all these other attendant algorithms, then we will also be terminating parental rights. And all of that is the law in Wisconsin. Very similar thing was happening in Indiana 2 years later when I was living there, and so on, right? This is a change. And so I wanted to register both how that idea came to be around stability and securitizing infants away from their parents, and how it was being mobilized in our present. And there are a few moments that the book does that. It really doesn't go past 1980, except for when it does, right? To sort of say that, like the hot, cold mother and the trad wife now, or the helicopter mother now, or all of these things, we do have echoes into our present, but this one is a straight continuity. All of these legal cases are the precedent for our contemporary moment.
A question that invites that kind of thinking across the 20th century and the present moment. So another arresting sentence of yours that I'd like to read twice, if the audience will indulge me, comes from the introduction. And of the mother, so you're speaking about the mother, or the figure you sometimes just call mother, which I really like. You say, quote, "She is judged on the ratio of her signal of care to the noise of herself." I'd like to read that one more time. It's really well done, She is judged on the ratio of her signal of care to the noise of herself. So what happens to this noise in the 20th century, and as we enter the 21st, do you think we're still living in the world that mid-20th century media made, or have new media altered the experience of mothering and pressures brought to bear on it? Big questions for you.
I know, this is the best dissertation defense. I recently wrote an essay for, of all places, the Financial Times. Weirdly, they're all right. There's fewer and fewer places you can write for, and on the distracted mother, which actually is very much working again, across with the paradigm from chapter 4 as we've just described it. And, as Dorothy Roberts calls it, family policing in the United States, what constitutes the distracted mother. But it includes also thinking very much about some sociological facts, right? One which always gets people is that mothers, again, and all of the question of mother and in the US context has all been deeply thought through and problematized in the introduction as well, spend more time today with their children doing more quote unquote maternal labor than that icon of the 1950s, the housewife, which Angela Davis will tell us already is a partial reality. And Stephanie Coontz will say was the way we never were. And nonetheless, at the real numbers, it's just exploded. So in essence, in a way, yes, right? Except there's more signal and there's also more noise, which would keep the ratio, which is, I think the word I used, the same, maybe, right? Like, because also at the same time, and these are these places where like we really registered the change. Many of the mothers in this book are also, in moments like joining the labor force for the first time. In chapter 6, I register women who are like recording stenography loops on like a 8-track to play while they take phone calls to sound like they're in an office as an early instance of telework, right? Like this is a lot of what's happening. And then they're trying to hide their children by using these sounds to cover over so that they can both labor and mother at once. Or to think about Arlie Hochschild, Professor Emerita here, telling us about the second shift, or then, further feminist correction has been the third shift, where like, yes, those compounding kinds and qualities of labor have only increased, right? And we can put that against real wages and inflation. So in a way, that's part of it. But the other way to put it would be a woman I interviewed for that essay who's talking in a very different register. She's not an academic, and I'm just asking her about her experience of mothering. And she says, like, the problem is now that we're just finally able to have something of ourselves and know who we want to be, there's this other distraction, the problem, the kid. And so I think I mean that sentence both ways, right? Like there's so much pressure at the sort of economic, labor, et cetera, psychological surveillance of mothers and other parents and other caregivers, because the book starts also with waged caregivers, not with mothers, and who are triply surveyed. And at the same time, there's the psychological and emotional resonance, which is Winnicott tells me there's no such thing as a mother. I'm always supposed to be mother baby. What about just me? And I think that the sentence is actually trying to capture multiple senses of that pain.
So we'll open the conversation up to audience questions in just a minute. But first, as in the moment in the podcast where the guest is invited to tout current projects and upcoming achievements, for those, especially in the room, who know you as the author of Distance Cure and the founding editor of Parapraxis, I'm wondering if you might want to talk about what you're working on now, how it comes out of this project, or maybe doesn't follow directly from this project.
Sure. My pleasure. That's what I was doing this morning. I'm like, yes, how to talk about Wilhelm Reich's children. I'm working on a book called All Freud's Children, A Story of Inheritance, which in some ways is like, maybe I'll do something else afterwards, let's see. But in some ways follows very much from the first and the second book and is a kind of synthetic gesture. In other ways not. It's being written for Penguin Press, so it will also read very differently, but is also the most demanding research I've had to do to date. Because it's trying to take very seriously this just omission in the history of science, which is that, in the 1980s, we went through the Freud Wars. Fred Cruz, who's also emeritus and recently passed, was a major instigator in the English department of those wars. Freud lost, Cruz won. And what Cruz had done as his major tool of winning that war was to use Freud's biography to totally discredit him. And so historians of science after the 80s have turned deeply away from biography or family life or intimate questions in order to answer their questions about the history of psychoanalysis better. But it's produced a pretty wild omission, I think, which is that we just haven't looked at how the first and second generation of analysts all analyzed their children, who then are the literal subject matter of theories we are told are universal. supposedly universal. And so that criticism that psychoanalysis is all, only about the fin de siècle, bourgeois family in Vienna, and it's all white and it's all Jewish and it's all upper middle class, is actually even more true. Like, it is actually about 10 kids. But then that theory begins to really travel and change. And the book also really wants to take that seriously. And in fact, it's not just Freud who analyzed at least one, but maybe actually two of his children. It's not just Melanie Klein, who didn't analyze all three of her children. It's the big corrective I try and issue. Wilhelm Reich's children, but it also looks at psychoanalysis as a kind of revolutionary family. So it looks at the family structure made by François Tosquelles, Catalan psychoanalyst, with Frantz Fanon, with Félix Guattari and Jean Horry, who are all kind of moving around both Spain and France and Algeria and Tunisia, and to try and trace out how theories of the family, literal families, actually were, as an intellectual history, kind of the same thing. Yes, there's some really good high gossip, but that's just coming along the way.
More interviews for that, or?
Yeah. I was just talking about that this morning because I'm now working with material recorded with living children. So I've interviewed Anna Freud's step-grandchildren who are still living. Melanie Klein's grandchildren are still living. Wilhelm Reich's children were alive. One is still alive. One has died since I began the book and interviewed her. I've spent time in Saint Alban with, Marie-Rose Tosquelles, who is now in her late 80s and a really good dancer. And with Fanon's work in Blida, and have been to Algeria and done the work there. And so, all of these actually is a very living history. Many of my subjects are in their 60s or 50s, but there are also people who are inaccessible, which has made things both more difficult, but also easier, because finally the Freud archive is completely open. And, for those of you who know, that took about 50, 60 years. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. As you know, I had a question about my, or related to my 18-month-old nephew, but I'll save that.
Ramsey was going to make me wild analyze him right now. And
it's true.
That was really exciting to me.
We'll save it though, because I'm sure there are many questions. Maybe we should take two at a time, starting here. And I think there's a mic. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm thinking of the way that you're framing motherhood also in the terms of whiteness in this cases that you're presenting, but also thinking about sort of Black feminist thought and like the book on revolutionary mothering that Alexis Pauline Gumbs, like other forms of mothering. And it's also in my mind the way, for example, that mothering is being weaponized with anchor babies and immigrant mothers as this sort of invading force. So I'm thinking also not just the history of it, but the future of it, and how, white motherhood is put in a pedestal, but then or other kinds of motherhood that are racialized, are often criminalized and weaponized, especially with this xenophobic rhetoric. And I'm wondering, what do you see this line as it's going forward in the times that we're living, with the research that you've been doing, and the dangers of mothering as a weapon?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I'm really hesitant always to take the past and try and just, move towards predicting the future. But I think about the future and I think about our present all the time. One place that I want to look at very much is how the mind sciences have absolutely stayed part and parcel with those questions. So in terms of enforcing separation at the border and many borders, both the US border, borders in Palestine, on and on, that has not changed. That is a continuity. The very same work that's being done in Bedford Hills, definitely not majority on white women, right? The supermajority is not white in that prison. Has absolutely continued to circulate through these kind of dragnet algorithmic operations that are increasing sentences. All of that has just remained operant. And I think on the sort of like to the same side, as you're saying, as a new form of white maternity is being put on a pedestal, as there's been mass, kind of rollback on feminist gains from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I lived for a year in a state where abortion was illegal not that long ago. All of it is part and parcel of the same picture. And the mind sciences, the human sciences have played their role, and it hasn't stopped. It just hasn't stopped. And so it will be 30 years before we have the archive access, right? But there are some really intense presentist indicators. Those psychologists will go and talk about their work, right? Cooperating with ICE. They'll go and talk about their work with the IDF. And so that's something I do track in the present. Yeah. And my fear is that we are in a kind of, it's getting more dragnet, more punishable. At the same time as the other thing is that, as I said, family separation subtends the entire book. And so from natal alienation onwards is a major theme. And in that way, it's also a continuity. And so I think I really also want to caution against the idea that, like, not that this is at all coming from you, but I've been asked a version of the question. I'll be like, but it was really good under Biden or something. Right? And I'm like, no. Yeah. And in fact, it's been really, really very much a piece of itself and part of American family ideology for 400 years. And that is something that's very stressed in the book, how the human sciences hooks into that ongoing political contest, both when it's Renee Spitz, right, and a kind of better figure, and when it's Leo Kanner, and when it sets up the Monahan report, right? It's really there. Psychologists have never really practiced neutrality, even as they're the same analysts who might say that they do. Yeah. Thank you.
More questions? Yeah, we have one up front. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is super interesting. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the shift from Freud to his successors in terms of this focus on the mother-child dyad. To what extent was that descriptive of what was happening in social practices? Like there was less of a reliance on a nanny or somebody else was taking care of the children, or to what extent was it instructive? Was it really trying to urge mothers to spend more time with their children?
Thank you. Wonderful questions. It's a sense both. It was overdetermined, the really fun answer you can always give when you work on the history of psychoanalysis, but is also true. It's a few things, right? Like in the interwar period in the US, as well as in the UK, where these people are largely working by that point, they're already leaving Austria a little bit. They've all fled Berlin. After 1933, there were only a few communist psychoanalysts basically remained in Berlin as long as they could. So it's really already emigrated. There's this kind of massive social change. The way I explain it to my students is I'm like, remember Downton Abbey? And there's all this worry from the very rich about people leaving the service because people are like, absolutely, fuck this. Yes, like that is occurring. And so there's on the one hand a real change in terms of labor, but at the same time, there's a huge panic that's introduced over and over and over again from Reconstruction onwards about purity in the family. And this would also hook up to the question of the present, right? What makes a family not pure and thus gives us the idea of the nuclear family, something that doesn't exist until the 1930s, right? Like as an idea. Is immense. And so, yes, there's all of this pressure to keep the family, quote unquote, pure, whether it's from, and this is part of the mother as medium history, the thoughts of others, the expressions of others, what a child will learn from these people or those people. In our present, it's the iPad as represented by my iPhone, vaccines, right? What kind of school? Don't give the 18-month-old nephew the screen because, again, right, this kind of dispurity mediation is part of that. So when you read them, Winnicott, for instance, is highly prescriptive. But he's also registering this social change that has taken place. He just doesn't name it as such, right? He's never like, and there has been a social change that has taken place. So what I'm talking about is specific. He's like, this is how it's always been. The family is weirdly one of these places where the idea of immutable universal just seems to work on people. So like I was just revisiting this with a student of mine yesterday. When I teach history of the family, the first thing I make them do is read the most boring historiographic debate from the 1980s and 90s about demography and registering social change. And I warn them that it's going to be really a slog, but it helps them see immediately, even in the 80s and 90s, how freaked out historians were to admit that it hadn't always been a mother, a father, and 2.2, an impossible number, children living behind a white picket fence. Winnicott and the other analysts are really bad at accepting that that's so. My third book is going to try and help explain why that is, I hope, right? Why psychoanalysis is interested in the immutable universal aspects of its theory, even as it's not so. Winnicott had no children, so that's not why. But yes, he is worked lots with children.
We have time for one or maybe two more questions. So let's take both of these back to back.
Hi, Hannah. Huge fan of your work. I'm sorry if this is a boring question, but I just would love to hear you tell us a little bit about the methodology of the book. You write as a materialist, as a psychoanalyst, through social theory, and you're able to draw together an astonishing range of archival and sort of contemporary work. So if you could just say a little bit about how you go about your research, I'd love to hear.
Thank you so much. And then could we also take the question over here, please?
So I really liked what you said about the me. Where is the me and the attachment, right? So I think attachment is often viewed mostly from the child lens, where the child, their life is determined by the attachment type they have to their mother. But I think I've also recently been seeing mothers who feel like they're attached to the child in that reverse direction, right? They feel a lot of meaning from their kids. And I work in an office, a housing office, and I've been noticing this phenomenon where mothers are calling our office because they just can't get a hold of their kids. Kids are ignoring phone calls, text messages from the mother. And I think that's kind of like a big worry for me in our conception of like what the family looks like here in 2025. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on this phenomenon, like what you think is happening.
Yeah, so much. And really like amazing opposite kinds of questions. And they're both wonderful. Thank you. So to Charmaine's question, how do I do my research? I think like at this point, there's a kind of deep texture and familiarity with the kind of side of things. So between the distance here and the beginning to really write this book in earnest, I did have to go acquire an entire field, which was history of the family, which played zero role in my PhD training, and is a huge field, huge. And the question also of U.S. maternity is the most overridden part of that field, in part because, to go back to, he's left now, but like there are very particular kinds of maternity that have, at highly sentimental literatures that have been made on the American family, the American mother. Again, dad is absent everywhere. And so it was very much about trying to bring together a socio-political and, therefore economic understanding of what is happening in the kind of picture with labor, what's happening in the picture with the PSY sciences, how are those things interacting for the first half of the book. And then as psychology proper drops away and now it's media research time, almost all of those people were first psychologists or sociologists, then it's to pick up that archive and see how they shake hands. And so it just involved a lot of kind of pairing. This is happening here. What is it registering? What is Winnicott talking about when he says it's now only a mother and a baby? And being like, oh, lo and behold, it turns out there's this massive change in family life and also in the labor market. And Winnicott gives us none of that, for instance, just to keep with that example. And doing that again and again and again. Or another example, why do we get a baby monitor in the 1930s? Like I pose this kind of question and I'm trying to look in these two literatures or three literatures to begin to suss it out. I think that is how I formulate this book, which is, again, very different from the book I'm currently writing. So it's hard to access. But thank you. And then, this question.
Sorry.
No, I mean, it's an amazing question because, right, like one thing that's very difficult is that I can join with everyone in that question. I can join with you, who's fielding these calls, being like, oh my God. I can join with the child who's like, I'm 20 and I just stop air tagging me. And I can also join with the mother function, the parent function, who has been told they are nothing but that function for 18 years and it's just impossible to turn off, right? And that person who's also been filled with all of this, and a lot of these stories are in the book, all of these panics about what happens if you don't survey, right? I'm right at the beginning of the book that it is the great pain of, I think, one of the great pains of our nation, that the most famous child separation from a parent is the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, when it happens every second that we're sitting here. But so it is. And then for 100 years, right, parents being like, well, if I look away, the worst thing ever will happen. And many different forces have stoked that, even as it's completely separated from what I might call a reality principle. And so, yeah, if you can't get a hold of your kid, that's going to freak you out if you've been told these things. But one thing I want to bring is from someone else, which is that recently I was speaking with a bunch of psychoanalysts, and like maybe this would be an almost wild analysis place to end for Ramsey too, which is, and the analyst was saying to me, none of the children I work with who are teenagers, a little younger than in the housing office here, none of them want to go hang out in person. And as I sat with them, I wanted to figure out why that was. And it turned out they know that if they go hang out in person, they're being surveyed. But if they hang out at a distance, each in their own bedroom and online, they can't be. They can outsmart their parents. And so, in fact, they don't want to go to the third place that we have this mass social panic about. They just want to feel a feeling of liberation. And so what makes me most sad about that story is, of course, that everyone kind of loses. And it sounds horrible. And I'm very sorry. But I think that's a bit what might be happening in that scene.
Yeah, I think Sherry Turkle says in one of her books that, when the parents are home with the kids, no observation. But then when they go out, it's helicopter time, which is like this weird duality now.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a beautiful discussion of the figure of the helicopter in this book also. Thank you so much, Hannah. Please join me in thanking Hannah.
You've been listening to Berkeley Talks, a UC Berkeley News podcast from the Office of Communications and Public Affairs that features lectures and conversations at Berkeley. Follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find all of our podcast episodes with transcripts and photos on UC Berkeley News at news.berkeley.edu/podcasts.